Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to the podcast. Previously, I've discussed melatonin and sleep on this podcast, and you can go back and look to actually several different episodes looking at the failed use of melatonin in healthy people to boost sleep, but also some interesting data regarding the use of melatonin as an antioxidant, a very effective antioxidant. And as I said, the first one of those episodes looking at melatonin and sleep and asking, does it help people with improving their sleep or even people with insomnia? And unfortunately, the answer was no, it's really not very effective in those specific circumstances. Today, however, I want to discuss the use of melatonin in a very specific condition. And what prompted me to investigate further is that for the condition that we're talking about today, based on some very recent data that came to light, I got really interested in, just sort of went down into a deep dive investigating this and all of the nuanced mechanisms and biology. I just thought, actually, it's a topic that I get asked a lot about. I know there is a huge need to discuss sleep within this condition specifically. So I thought it would be time to do an updated podcast. That condition that we're talking about today is autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. And specifically, I wanted to delve into a very recent, intriguing meta-analysis. And by the way, a meta-analysis, as we've spoken about on this podcast before, is just a fancy statistical scientific method where we gather together all of the individual studies that have been published on a specific effect, and we put them into a big statistical bucket, and we look at the overall general effect, as it were. And this new study used this meta-analysis approach, and it investigated the use of melatonin in treating sleep disorders among individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Just as a gentle reminder at the top of this episode, but it is a really important reminder, I am not a pediatrician nor a prescribing medical doctor. At least nothing we will cover here should be taken as medical advice or otherwise. Instead, I am simply communicating the scientific data. So this podcast in general, and this episode specifically as well, is scientifically descriptive. It's not medically prescriptive. Anything you consider regarding this podcast and what you would want to do with the information, please just run it by a doctor, run it by your pediatrician. And with all of that serious talk aside, some background regarding sleep and autism spectrum disorder. What we've discovered now, actually over quite some years, is that individuals with autism spectrum disorder are far more likely to experience sleep problems, and sleep problems of numerous different kinds. And these aren't just minor annoyances. They profoundly impact the daily functioning of the individual, exacerbating every one of the behavioral symptoms that faces many of the individuals with autism spectrum disorder, and as a consequence will diminish overall life and health span. And if you look across all studies from infancy through to adulthood, disrupted sleep is a constant, highly prevalent, and highly disabling problem that most people with autism spectrum disorder will face. Historically, both non-pharmaceutical and pharmaceutical treatments have been employed to tackle these issues in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And these include things such as sleep hygiene, for example, establishing a really consistent bedtime, reducing exposure to screens, having relaxation time, trying to stay as regular with wake-up times as possible. And then there are lots of different medications that have been used. I won't go into detail for those too. But the goal has always been to try to enhance the sleep quality of these patients. But as we know, not all interventions are created equally, nor do they work universally. This brings us on to the role of melatonin, which, as you'll remember, is a hormone, and it is a hormone that, among many other things that it does, regulates your sleep-wake cycle timing. So what is the goal here with autism spectrum disorder and melatonin? Why focus on melatonin? The answer is this lingering belief that melatonin could help sleep. And as I've said before, it is ineffective to help most people improve their sleep and help most people with insomnia. But what about autism? Well, looking at the data, melatonin has shown some promise. But the issue here is what we're trying to target with melatonin when it comes to sleep help for autism spectrum disorder. And you'll remember that there isn't just one type of a sleep problem in autism spectrum disorder. For example, always just consistently having a hard time falling asleep or always waking back up and not being able to get back to sleep. There are many different varied kinds of sleep problems that these individuals will face. And it is that variability that is crucial because it underscores the need for personalized treatment plans. This is not just simply about a one-size-fits-all issue when it comes to solving, like a magic silver bullet, all of the sleep problems for all individuals with autism spectrum disorder. It's about understanding who specifically will benefit from one particular treatment, such as melatonin, and in what dosage and under what conditions. These are the types of levels of specificity that medicine is now starting to think about, and certainly, at least, medicine absolutely has to accomplish. The one-size-fits-all approach no longer serves us, and it must no longer be acceptable in that sense. A supporter of today's podcast is Magic Spoon. I have a confession to make. I have had a love affair with cereal for most of my life, but when I started to sort of focus on wellness and health, I realized that most cereals, they were just really unhealthy, so I stopped eating them and life was much more miserable as a consequence. And then my friend, Dr. Peter Attia, introduced me to a company called Magic Spoon, and everything changed. Magic Spoon is a fantastic cereal company. You can check them out. They have really healthy, high-protein cereal. When my first box arrived, I literally just grabbed a handful and inhaled it on the spot. Magic Spoon, in addition to their cereals, which you should absolutely check out, they have now introduced Magic Spoon treats. And I have certainly added them into my panoply of things that I enjoy eating and that I use in terms of my wellness and my fitness routines. They've got 11 grams of protein, just 1 gram of sugar, just 4 net carbs per bar. And they're just really well balanced if you're looking for this type of thing. There's tons of flavors to choose from: chocolate peanut butter, blueberry, double chocolate, hashtag my favorite, strawberry milkshake, you name it, they've got it. Magic Spoon treats are available, I'm sure, at your nearest grocery store. Hunt them down. You can find them online. If you're looking for a healthy, fueling snack, I would suggest checking them out. For folks listening to this podcast, Magic Spoon has provided an offer. You can actually get $5 off your next order. And if you want that, just go over to magicspoon.com/Matt Walker. And as I said, you will get $5 off there. Let's get back to the show now. That's where the meta-analysis that we're focused on today starts to help a little bit by looking at studies on melatonin and sleep in children. And for this particular study, the researchers followed a protocol known as the PRISMA protocol, which is short for the Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. I know. We scientists, we love our alphabet spaghetti. And isn't that just a complete word salad piece of nonsense? But just for those scientists out there, just as an FYI, that's the approach that they used. The researchers embarked on a very thorough search across multiple databases. These databases, why would you be familiar? Most of you are probably not scientists out there. Essentially think of them as vast libraries of scientific publications. And there are many different libraries that we can go and visit, and we can search within each one of those libraries to extract all of the individual publications on a particular topic. So the researchers were going around all of these vast different libraries, going into their back catalog of all the journals and extracting all of the studies on sleep, autism spectrum disorder in children. And here is where it gets interesting. They didn't just accept any study. They had a very specific criteria. The studies needed to involve, of course, individuals who were clinically diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And the studies had to be specifically looking at the effects of melatonin, not just in general, but on specific sleep parameters. Granular details here, I mean things such as total sleep time, the time it takes you to fall asleep, how efficient is your sleep, what is the quality of your sleep. So all of these different parameters. Why? Well, because as I told you, different individuals with autism spectrum disorder will suffer from different types of sleep problems. And only studies that directly compared melatonin to a placebo or control group were included, which is a criteria for assessing the true effectiveness of melatonin. And once they had the select studies, they evaluated them for bias. Things such as how the study was collected, were there any deviations from standard protocols, how complete and accurate was the data reporting. And just to bore you with the wonderfulness of science, this is done using a tool called a Cochrane's risk of bias tool. Never did you think when you started listening to this episode that it would get this granular and nerdy. Help the listeners, Matthew, for goodness sake. Just think of that last tool as it's kind of like a magnifying glass, I guess. It's going to be a terrible analogy. I'm going to go with it. The risk of bias tool is a little bit like a magnifying glass in that it spots any possible areas where the studies may not quite measure up to gold standard and treats those analyses appropriately in terms of their data and the weighting of the data in terms of the assessment. Anyway, to the data, let's get to it. This is the stuff that you're actually interested in. Thanks for sticking with me, by the way, through the nerdiness of the methods. Let's see what they found. First, let's start with the initial feature that they focused on, which was total amount of sleep. Here, there was a significant positive relationship across the studies with melatonin, meaning melatonin increased the amount of total sleep time relative to the placebo condition. And based on those fancy metrics that were being used statistically, what the researchers were able to demonstrate was that that benefit of melatonin on total sleep time in individuals with autism spectrum disorder was very tight. It was very reliable, and that's what we like to see in science. That's a type of finding that we feel is trustworthy. Moving on to sleep onset latency. Now, that's the time it takes to fall asleep. And again, here, melatonin showed a beneficial role in children with autism spectrum disorder. Those children were, on average, across all of those studies, able to fall asleep faster having been given melatonin relative to placebo. And once again, using those fancy statistical methods, the researchers reported that the effect of melatonin on helping kids with autism spectrum disorder fall asleep faster was indeed reliable and robust in its size. Okay, next sleep feature, sleep efficiency. Sleep efficiency is a measure of sleep quality. In other words, it measures how much time were you asleep relative to the amount of time you're in bed. So in other words, if you're in bed for 8 hours, how much of that 8 hours of time that you're in bed are you spent asleep. The greater the percentage, the greater your sleep efficiency, and that usually reflects the quality of your sleep. And we typically like to see individuals at least 85% and above in terms of their sleep efficiency. Well, when it came to melatonin, individuals were experiencing better quality of sleep, meaning that they had fewer awakenings after initially falling asleep, and therefore the efficiency of their sleep, rather than waking up, going back to sleep, waking up, going back to sleep, waking up, the efficiency of their sleep, because of their sleep not being as fragmented and being more stable, was higher. However, the meta-analysis here for this feature of sleep, for sleep efficiency, indicated that the effect was really quite variable across studies. It was there for some studies, wasn't there for other studies. Meaning for sleep quality issues, I suppose when it comes to melatonin here for sleep efficiency, not for total sleep time or falling asleep that we just discussed, but when it comes to sleep efficiency, I think the best label here on the bottle would be results may vary. And looking at the data, if you dig into the meta-analysis and you look at each one of the studies, it may vary a lot. So just keep that in mind. A sponsor of today's show is Inside Tracker, which is a service that comes out to your home and they will analyze your blood and your DNA to know precisely what is going on inside of you. Hence the name Inside Tracker. They look at your blood, your metabolic signals, your hormonal health metrics, and then they give you a personalized, actionable set of lifestyle changes in response to that readout. And the goal there is to improve your health. I was looking and informed they have some new cardiovascular and new hormonal biomarkers that I'm particularly interested in. One that I'm focused on is something called ApoB, which is an absolutely critical heart health measure. And I get it done now with them somewhere between 4 to 6 times a year. Why? Well, my family unfortunately has a strong history of cardiovascular disease, so I am checking that pretty ruthlessly. And by the way, I do buy the product myself out of pocket. I don't want to fall prey to any of those trappings and undue incentives. Although with full admission, I still use my own discount code that you can use to get some money off. And that code for you is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. So just go over to insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. And again, if you want to get that discount, it is insidetracker.com/Matt Walker. Thanks very much. However, not all results were as straightforward as this. When it came to the amount of total time spent awake at night after falling asleep, which is a slightly different measure of efficiency. In other words, how many times were you waking up throughout the night? Here, melatonin, unfortunately, showed no benefit for kids who had autism spectrum disorder relative to placebo. In other words, melatonin wasn't reliable. It wasn't scientifically effective at reducing the number of awakenings that those children were suffering throughout the night. But overall, I think the findings suggest a potential here. For instance, if melatonin allows a child to settle and fall asleep a little faster, it can be both a huge relief for the individual who is suffering from autism spectrum disorder and also their caregivers as well, of course, and the family. And that improved quality of sleep, the sleep efficiency, could mean that those individuals were waking up feeling more restored. Now, they didn't measure that in any of these studies, so we don't know that, but that's typically what improved sleep efficiency will lead to, a greater feeling of restoration the next morning. And that restoration, we would hope, would lead to improved cognitive function and also overall health. Now, again, they didn't measure those things, but that would be the prediction for the next studies. But not so fast. The study also looked at adverse outcomes. Whenever you're giving a bioactive agent, you have to expect these things. And keep in mind that melatonin, it's a bioactive hormone. And sometimes when I go to the supermarket or the grocery store, as they say over here in America, and you go down that sort of health and wellness aisle and you see a big purple sort of strip and it's all about melatonin, and there's huge amounts of pediatric melatonin at very large doses. I think at least I have not done a good enough job personally of getting the word out as to how to contextualize that. Just to put that in context, imagine me coming along to you, a parent, and saying, look, tonight I would like you to dose your child with a bioactive hormone. I would like you to dose them with a concentration that is maybe 5, 10, almost 100 times more than their body naturally releases. We also know that that hormone that you're giving them is involved not just in regulating their sleep-wake schedule, but also involved in their reproductive development. And I would like you to start dosing this with a medication that is not regulated by the FDA. And I'd like you to do it every single night. Sleep soundly at night doing that. Of course, that's hyperbolic. I'm just using it as an extreme example. But it has made me think deeply about that when I've walked down those aisles and wondering what I would say to parents. And I get asked this all the time being out in public. And so I have to offer an answer. It's an answer that is along those lines. But anyway, coming back to the study, the researchers did look at adverse outcomes because those are also reported in those studies. And I would say overall, melatonin was relatively well tolerated by the participants, which is a hopeful sign, of course. And I think that could potentially benefit here. And that's why I'm doing this podcast, because I thought it was very hopeful, interesting data. But please be aware that there were a collection of adverse events that were noted during the trials that anyone out there should be aware of. What were they? Well, they included the following. In those children who were treated with melatonin, there were increased reports of fatigue, of mood swings, abdominal pain in the child, restlessness, anxiety, constipation, diarrhea, daytime lethargy, or some of the journals, if you look into them, they described it as laziness. I'm not sure if it's really laziness. I think it's just lethargy is a better description. They also reported dizziness as well as daytime drowsiness. Keep in mind, however, again, that sounds like a very damning list, but most of those effects were typically moderate to mild. But they do remind us that a widely used supplement should be administered with care and done so under medical supervision. And you should, if you're a parent and you're interested in the use of melatonin for your child who has autism spectrum disorder, please go and see your pediatrician and your doctor. There are prescription grade melatonin brands out there. You can't buy them over the counter. They are prescription, but that's the safest way, because right now in the supermarket aisles and the grocery stores, those things are unregulated by the FDA, and I've spoken a lot about that sort of potential Wild West. So where do we stand after all of this? Well, I think melatonin has demonstrated some really promising possibility here to help individuals specifically who have autism spectrum disorder, and perhaps help them with not all, but some features of their sleep problems, in particular improvements in the ability to fall asleep and improvements in the overall total amount of sleep, and maybe some improvements in sleep efficiency as well. But as I said, those studies have also demonstrated that melatonin is not uniformly good at improving all of the different sleep issues. It is a non-silver bullet here. It's not going to be the one thing that solves all sleep problems for all children with autism spectrum disorder. And that variability, for me at least, underscores the need for personalized treatment plans when you're considering melatonin therapy. Make sure that you speak about that with your pediatrician and your doctor as well. Also, make sure that you ask about the potential adverse symptom reactions that someone may want to make you aware of regarding the use of melatonin. But in general, I think these findings are a really interesting step forward in our goal to improve the sleep and therefore the lives of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. They also highlight the complexities of trying to treat those individuals because their sleep problems aren't of just one kind. There are many different kinds, and there are issues with drugs, side effects with drugs as well. In fact, almost all drugs have side effects. It's not just melatonin. A long-standing partner of today's podcast is Element, spelled L-M-N-T. Element is a sugar-free electrolyte drink mix. And for me, it was the sugar-free part of that made me start using it, probably 2 years ago now. And here again, by the way, I do buy my own supply just to stay objective. But beyond having the electrolytes in the right balance for human physiology, the other thing that I'm a fan of regarding Element is that it's scientifically backed. If you look up the people who created the company, you'll find some pretty heavy-hitting physiology, biochemistry, pharmacology knowledge. All of that's baked into the product. And again, it all comes without the downside of any sugar. And now, since I am such a devotee of their product, and P.S., I really do use them each day. I use it for my workout, and then I use it in my protein shakes. I really do, folks. I really do use it. I badgered them, and they have agreed to give you fine folks an 8-count completely free sample pack with any purchase of Element. And to get that, you do have to use the following link, and that is lmnt.com/Matt Walker. So if you'd like some free product with your purchase, just go to lmnt.com/Matt Walker, and you can pick up your free swag. What about tips for sleep in kids, perhaps, is what you're thinking about at this end stage, and regardless maybe of whether they are neurodiverse or not. Let me run through what I typically offer as my 10 sort of short recommendations to speak with your pediatrician about, remembering that these are scientifically descriptive suggestions, not medically prescriptive pieces of advice. You've heard some of these before, but let's go through them. Number 1, choose a consistent bedtime and wake-up time for your child. This consistency will help your child's own natural melatonin rhythm get on a regular schedule. Number 2, make sure bedtime isn't too early. This may sound strange coming from someone like me, but for example, an 8 p.m. bedtime is perhaps a little bit early for certain age groups. For example, if you were to look at 10-year-olds, on average, 8 p.m. may be a little bit too early. So check with people like the National Sleep Foundation on the recommendations for typical time to bed and time to wake up. But also, by the way, even though I'm saying that as an example, 8 p.m. for 10-year-olds may be a little bit too early. For some 10-year-olds, that may be perfectly right because they are very much early birds and they like to go to bed early and wake up early. It's all idiosyncratic to the individual, but just keep that in mind. It is important not to try to put your child to bed too early in an age inappropriate manner. And this is particularly true for neurodiverse children who may struggle with sleep if you put them to bed too early. And it can cause them anxiety, it can cause you anxiety. And as they become more anxious, their sleep is only going to get worse because they start to associate their bed with this place where they're tossing and turning and lying awake and they get frustrated. Not a good thing at all. Number 3, help your child get natural sunlight in the morning. Morning sunlight sets our brain's internal clock so we can feel asleep at the right time of night and awake throughout the waking daytime. Number 4, ensure your child is getting some form of physical activity during the day. Lots of studies demonstrating that kind of physical activity is gold when it comes to improving sleep. Number 5, minimize naps try not to make them longer than 1 hour. Now, this depends, of course, on the age of your child, very specifically, of course, but try to be mindful of minimizing naps. Try not to have naps that are perhaps longer than an hour after 4 p.m. for at least school-age children. So again, to be specific, for school-age children, try not to have naps that are longer than an hour or occur after 4 p.m. Naps can interfere with the ability to go to sleep at night. Number 6, avoid caffeine, including many types of sodas, tea. Be careful of chocolate. Look on the back. You'd be surprised. Number 7, turn off all screens and smartphones at least 30 minutes before bedtime for your child. Number 8, in the evening leading up to bedtime, turn down all of the lights, or at least 50 to 70% of the lights in the house. Set any devices into night mode. That dim light exposure is wonderful for signaling to the brain it is nighttime, it is time to sleep, it's time to release melatonin. It's a psychological trigger, it's an environmental trigger for your child. It's a great tool to implement. Number 9, have a wind down routine. It is absolutely essential. Do this in place of screens. Have your child identify an activity that is calming and soothing, such as reading a book to them, or coloring, or listening to music. If a bath is actually too stimulating because you have bath time, you play around, and that's great too, that's fantastic. But if that's the case, try to move the bath time a little bit earlier in the evening, such as right after dinner, so that the child isn't so activated. And number 10, help your child learn to fall asleep without needing you or the devices to be there with them. That way they will settle down into their own bedtime routine. And this is for particular age groups. We're talking about kids here. We're not talking about that sort of third rail lightning rod of sleep training and the cry it out method and all of that stuff. We're talking about children here. So it's really important to help your child learn to fall asleep without needing you or their devices. And as I said, that way they will settle down into their own bedtime naturally, according to their own confidence. And when they wake up throughout the night, and since we all wake up throughout the night, they'll be able to go back to sleep by themselves without becoming fretful and being fully awake and coming through to wake you up, etc. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Anyway, I hope those 10 are helpful. Please do speak with your doctor and your pediatrician if you want to consider any of this non-prescriptive, descriptive advice. I hope this podcast episode in particular for those parents with children with autism spectrum disorder has been somewhat useful. Please send me feedback on social media. Let me know what more you want to learn. What have I not done well? How can I be doing this better? And as always, thanks so much for tuning in. I really, really appreciate it. There's no need to go and leave reviews. I would love you to leave a review if you like, or lambast me in reviews, whatever you like. The important thing is just that you're listening and you are sleep interested and sleep curious. That to me is the greatest reward. I don't care about reviews or positions in charts and all of that good stuff. I shouldn't be saying this. The podcast team is like crying right now and they're gone into the fetal position. They're rocking at this stage of me saying this, but please don't. Just enjoy it. If you feel moved to review, please do. I'd love that. And I love listening to or reading, and I read all the reviews. I do, to learn what I'm not doing well and how can I improve. Okay, that's it. Thanks for tuning in. Take care and bye for now.